Welcome back to Analysis, where we're talking about the latest measures taken against the Uyghur Muslims by the Chinese government. Protests and riots in China's autonomous Xinjiang province in the recent years have shown the growing discontent of native Uyghur Muslims. Migration into the northwestern region, coupled with increasingly repressive policies against the Uyghurs, has meant that they are now a declining proportion of the population. So, are we seeing the beginning of the end of the Uyghur Muslims in China? Joining my guest from the first half of the programme now on Skype is Dr. Hyun Ma from the Department of History in Frostburg State University in the United States. Well, welcome back to the programme. Rod, do you think that that what we're beginning to see now is a combination of economic and migration factors, which is going to erode the standing of the Uyghur Muslims until it's virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the population?
The demographic balance has been changing for some considerable time, and it will continue. The immigration of Han Chinese into the region, I'm sure, will continue, and the balance will alter increasingly in Han Chinese favour. But I just want to say that listening to everything that Enver has said reminds me of the real tragedy of all this. It didn't have to be that way. The Uyghurs are a wonderful people. They are peaceful in many, many ways. Their attachment to their religion is not a fundamentalist or an extremist attachment. And the Chinese just seem to have failed to understand this. I can see why a communist regime should have worries about organized religion. And the Chinese really only tolerate religious organizations that are somehow affiliated to the state. And of course, this doesn't happen in Xinjiang. And it doesn't happen for the people of Xinjiang. And the Chinese try and force them into a sort of Chinese-type straitjacket, which is not paying in any sense due attention to the cultural and religious traditions of the people of Xinjiang. And that, if they had been more open to those kind of ideas, we wouldn't have found ourselves, I think, in the kind of position where they seem to be polarizing. It seems to be that the Chinese policies, more than anything else, is leading to that polarization. And of course, as was said earlier in the program, there are now more knowledge available to young people and others in Xinjiang, that there is a world out there, that there are other ways of looking at things, and there are other ways of responding to these things. So Mr. Nurbekri has a little bit of sense on his side when he says that there are outside, as it were, influences, because people can see that there are other ways. But by and large, what we've seen in Xinjiang, the instances such as we know of them, have been very localized in affairs. They've been responses to local events by local people, not responding to some sort of mythical central command centered outside China. There's no real evidence of any sort of strong organization of that type. But one has to hand it to the Chinese, and it is important to say this, that when something like what happened in Kunming happens, the state has to respond and has to try and find out what was happening, why it was happening, and to prevent it happening elsewhere, because that too was a tragedy.
Do you think that, I mean, it's still, what, 42% of the population? I mean, that's a lot of people to kind of eradicate from the cultural scene, isn't it? I mean, it's not like you're talking about 3% of the population or something.
I don't believe that the Uyghur people will be wiped out from this region and from the history. And then if we look at it somewhere else, we can see that you cannot just make the nation disappear. And what I can see from here is that, for example, we used to chant that China lie, people die. The Chinese government, somehow they needed a strong enemy for them to fight. And then those Uyghur people, they turned out to be more peace-loving people. So they need to create a kind of chaos and for them to justify their own heavy military presence in the region. It's not only because that the Islamic fundamentalists know, because they want to get that energy from Xinjiang, from Central Asia, and from the Middle East, because the energy supply line nowadays is going through the South China Sea. So that is very vulnerable to attack. And I think this is Chinese long-term strategy. And that's why they need a kind of strong hand in this region, and to make sure you stay quiet. And this we understand, and we also know that the harder you press, the stronger resistance you will get. And this is what will happen.
Dr. Ma, do you think that's right, that both the studio guests have said about the peaceful traditions of the Uyghurs, but in a response to a kind of heavy-handed approach from the central state, do you think that could change, or at least change for some activists?
Yes, I totally agree with the two speakers on the Chinese policy on Xinjiang, and also on the Uyghur nature, as a peaceful, loving people. If you think about Uyghur traditions, you have so much rich music, dance, other traditions. It simply indicates Uyghur Muslims are very moderate, very artistic, if you will. So I totally agree. I think one point I don't agree is, we know, of course, we always talk about Muslim-state relationship, almost everywhere. But for Chinese case, I think we have to look at a sort of triangle relationship among the Uyghur Muslims, the Xinjiang Authority, and the Beijing Authority. So simply means, sometimes when you look at all these policies implemented in Xinjiang, that's not the policy you can say implemented in other provinces. So that's why I think there is a distinction between Xinjiang and Beijing. And of course, the problem is, since Xinjiang regime, Xinjiang government is part of Chinese government, so that's why I think people always, try to understand the Xinjiang policy as Chinese policy. So now I think you really gradually see these differences or distinctions. So people more begin to focus on Xinjiang policies, on Xinjiang regulations, on Xinjiang prosecutions of Uyghur people. So I totally agree with.
Okay. Rod, the Chinese spokesman that we showed, and you mentioned it, was talking about outside influences, but actually the Chinese state's support for Pakistan tends to get the Pakistanis to limit the influence of Taliban and related Islamic forces in China, doesn't it?
I think that's certainly one of the objectives of Chinese state policy and China's relations with Pakistan, and indeed China's relations with Afghanistan.
Does it work?
Not entirely. I mean, because we know that there were a number of Uyghurs captured by the Americans and held in Guantanamo for a long time. There are individual cases, yes. What relationship that has to any sort of idea of an organized group or groups operating from outside China is totally unproven.
Those Uyghur captives were later released and exonerated, weren't they?
They were later released, and it's a very, well, these kind of things by their nature are very murky. But there is no consistent sign of organized groups outside China having an effective way of organizing violence inside China or in Xinjiang. But there is more knowledge of these kind of things available to people. There is more. They are able to hear about these kind of things, and some people who might have been pushed or found themselves pushed beyond their endurance might turn to that kind of thing.
Do you think that's happening, Enver? Because it would be in some senses a reasonable and certainly not an unexpected result of continued levels of repression that some people, not because they're inspired from outside, but simply because they don't like what's happening to their community.
If we look at that, before the July riots in Urumqi in 2009, you can find many more Uyghur Muslims sitting outside and in the street having beer with that barbecue. And after that, you can see more and more of them going to the mosque. And this is what happens because Uyghur people, they try to distinguish themselves from Chinese, and this is the only way, because we look like each other with that Han Chinese. And this, unfortunately, it is what the Chinese government wanted, because they pushed those people to this way. Then they will claim, look, they are now more Islamic extremists. And to everybody's disappointment that Chinese Secret Service has penetrated almost 90% of Uyghur organizations. For example, Sweden secret police, they have captured one Uyghur agent, and they sentenced him 4 years by spying on Uyghur community. And we interviewed that one of MP from Sweden, and what he told us that 1 in 4 Uyghur people living outside China is working for the Chinese. In such case, so there isn't any organized event or organized things can take place inside Xinjiang. There's nobody believe that, and the Chinese government, they knew it. So that's why we were wondering how 8 people with 20 long knives can travel long distance from Xinjiang to Kunming, have not been discovered. That is the murky point.
Well, let's come back to that. We'll speculate perhaps a little bit on that in a moment. But Dr. Mao, is that your picture of what's happening, that there's perhaps a limited amount of international interference, as the Chinese call it here, but there is a growing cultural identification with the Muslim religion because of the level of repression? I think that's what Emma was suggesting.
Yes, I do see a cultural resistance from the Uyghur Muslims, especially after July incident in Urumqi in 2009. Simply now, I think since Uyghur people, they have no weapons, they have no other resources, I think they only use their culture and religion as kind of, weapon to resist against the Chinese repression. So I totally agree with that point.
Rod, do you think, just let's, we can't know, but a knife attack, I mean, we obviously have one here in the killing of Lee Rigby, but perhaps that points to the same thing, that these are groups that aren't really connected to any organised, and certainly to any international franchise, who might well be using more sophisticated weapons.
Well, it certainly doesn't look particularly well funded. The organisation may well have been there for them to get themselves to where they did and to do what they did in a sort of organised way. And I think this is part of what is the worry for the Chinese, because this kind of activity doesn't seem to have happened before in China outside Xinjiang, and indeed inside Xinjiang. Most of the manifestations that we have seen of even violent opposition have been small-scale, sort of immediate reactions to immediate events, rather than this one, which seems to have a strong planned element. Now, whether that then argues for an organisation, or whether it's just a number of people getting together to say, we've got to do something, who knows? I suspect probably more the latter, because, as Enver says, the Chinese intelligence authorities are pretty efficient one way and another.
And we saw in the film that began the programme some film of Ibrahim Tohti, the academic that's been arrested, and some commentary from his wife. Do you think that his situation will be worsened by the environment created by this attack?
Ilham Tohti, his arrest, it is a mystery. Nobody understands why, because nothing happened before it, nothing happened after it, and why now? And there's something also quite mysterious about him, that not any Uyghur people can say anything against that Chinese policy and safely living inside China, but he's seems to be exceptional. And we were wondering how. And then he suddenly got arrested. And this is, we just don't understand and what will happen to him.
Dr. Ma, what does it tell us about Chinese policy that even in the interviews that we ran at the beginning with Ibrahim Tohti's wife, she said, you know, he's not fomenting separatism. Well, you know, to be that worried about an accusation like that is indicative, do you think?
I think it's very interesting because if you look at Professor Tohti and other cases, you really have to look at the Chinese context. So I think one way to look at this issue is probably to ask what happened in Xinjiang during, Ilham Tohti's arrest. I think one question probably will be, is there anything going on in Xinjiang, in current Chinese politics, in Xinjiang? Because if you look at China's anti-corruption campaign, I think which already reached to Xinjiang, so that's why I think local authority, they try to create some tensions, by arresting some famous guy like Tohti. Then you can basically shift attention from anti-corruption to anti-terrorism. That's what I see from the arrest of Ilham Tohti.
Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I mean, it's a very difficult one to fathom out what the imaginations within the Chinese security services were that led to his arrest. But clearly they have. They are not going to go back on it. The word is that he's being charged with things like separatism, which, as his wife said, potentially carries a very serious penalty. And
just talk us through that, because I mean, I think to many people listening to that, and indeed to the interviews at the head of the programme, that will be, in what has been a sort of semi-autonomous province, for that to be such a seriously regarded crime. Just talk us through why that is and how that operates.
Well, I mean, Xinjiang is a very important area strategically and economically for the Chinese state, and they are determined to maintain their absolute control there, which partly explains the way that they treat the indigenous population. And they see any...
So it's a bit like the British elite's reaction to Scottish independence, but with guns and prisons. Is that what you're saying?
That's what you're saying, I'm saying. They do and have traditionally reacted very strongly to anything that they see as aiming to break up the Chinese state. So this applies particularly to Xinjiang and to Tibet. It also applies very much to their relationship with Taiwan and whether or not Taiwan is going to become independent and split away from China. The Chinese say that's a red line for them. So they have this tendency of fitting any actions by oppositionists, by people opposed to their rule, into this narrative of trying to undermine or split away essential parts of the Chinese state. And therefore they feel that they have no alternative but to deal very harshly with anything that happens or anyone who advocates that kind of thing. And Ilham Tohti seems to have got caught up in that particular narrative because he is an outspoken person. Whether he has been a person who has been able to speak out on license, as it were, and that license has now been withdrawn, who knows? This is part of the sort of Alice in Wonderland world of dissident life in China. But what we can see now is that the Chinese state has decided to throw the book at him, and I can't see them being particularly merciful. That doesn't mean that they're going to demand a death penalty necessarily, but a severe prison sentence is almost certainly on the cards.
Is that what you reckon?
Probably I have some slightly different point of view on it. If we look at that Chinese dissidents during the last 2 decades, every time that one of the United States president visit China, Chinese, they will release one. The second time we visit, they will release another one. Release one, they capture another one. So this is somehow the CCP, the Chinese government, they are playing with that international law and world and try to fooling them. Chinese government think tank thinkers, they are very smart. They know how to create the situation and just fit for the Chinese government, a continuation of the CCP as a ruling party. When they needed that war on terror started. And they also claim that they have terrorists back home. But by then, there wasn't any terrorist attack. So they started creating this. For example, in 2007, they claim that they have cracked down an East Turkestan terrorist training camp in the southern part of Xinjiang. 4 years later, we managed to find out the truth. That was a coal mine run by Uyghurs because they couldn't get license, so they ran illegally. And the Chinese authorities, they are not happy with that. They sent the police to stop them, and there was conflict, and then one police got killed. Then this being reported as a successful anti-terrorist action. That is what is happening.
Dr. Ma, do you see a policy that could stabilise the situation? Because, you know, states undergoing the degree of industrialisation or reindustrialisation that the Chinese states going are not renowned for their careful treatment of minorities or of internal, you know, national questions.
No, I think actually from the recent Chinese comments, especially from Beijing, you have a Chinese Central Party's Training Institute. Some scholars actually began to argue that you should cooperate with Uyghur intellectuals, you know, to solve the Uyghur issue. So I really say, you know, there's an indication that the central government probably tried to solve the issue, but the problem is the local government in Xinjiang, they try to create a problem. So that's why from a national perspective, I say, you know, if China wants to really, you know, guarantee its energy pipeline from Central Asia, you know, from Xinjiang, even from Middle East through Kashgar to further in future, you really have to maintain a peaceful relationship with the Uyghur. But from the local, you know, authorities' perspective, if they create, you know, tensions, create, you know, violence, and of course you can imagine you have a lot of budget, you have larger, you know, resources to be used by local officials. We see a lot of pictures, basically, you know, to tell how local officials, they purchase, you know, luxury cars, like city bands, you know. They try to use all kinds of sovereignty excuse, try to enrich themselves, try to get benefit from this, you know, national issue. So I think for the long run, the Beijing government probably will realize how its local government try to, you know, hijack or even try to, you know, channel the attention how to, you know, hijack this issue to benefit themselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ma. Thank you for joining us, because that brings us to the end of the programme. So, and my thanks to my studio guests here as well. Do rejoin us for future editions of Analysis.